A warm welcome to this discussion entitled Palestinian Healthcare, Whose Responsibility? I'm Natasha Hausdorff, a director of the NGO UK Lawyers for Israel, and I'm joined from Israel by Eugene Kontorovich, Professor of Law at George Mason's Antonin Scalia School of Law and head of the International Law Department at the Kohelet Policy Forum, a Jerusalem-based think tank. His scholarship has been cited in leading international law cases, and he's recognized as one of the world's preeminent experts on international law and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, a highly sought after speaker, so we're very grateful that you have been able to join us at short notice and by popular demand to address reporting that has been gaining traction in the media in the last few weeks concerning the provision of healthcare, principally with respect to Palestinians living in the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority and those living under Hamas rule in the Gaza Strip. Now, what began as initially positive reports of Israel leading the world in respect of the speed and efficiency of its vaccination rollout rapidly changed to media outlets and certain activist organizations accusing Israel of failing in its alleged obligation to vaccinate the Palestinians. These reports quickly began to invoke international law, arguing that Israel was breaching its international legal obligations. So to address the legal framework and the application of international law to set the record straight, Professor Kontorovich, over to you. You're on mute, Professor. The immortal word.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Natasha, for the wonderful introduction. And thank you to everyone at the UK Lawyers for Israel for hosting this event. And thank you all for joining. So I want to put this in context. There has not been any kind of claim that Israel is responsible for the healthcare of the Palestinians or for the COVID response in particular for the Palestinian Authority. Until January 3rd, 2021, when, for the first time, when it became clear that Israel was at the cutting edge of the world in vaccinations for COVID, and Israel rapidly emerged as the leading vaccinator in the world by far, and was getting a lot of good press. At that time, for the first time, an article appeared in The Guardian on January 3rd, 2021, raising a contention that Israel was failing in some kind of responsibility to vaccinate or provide vaccinations to the Palestinian Authority. Did not really make clear any particular legal basis on which it relied, but this claim seemed to get a lot of traction as Israel's vaccination campaign continued to far outpace the rest of the world. And the news story became, while Israel is getting good press, it's nonetheless doing something bad. And several NGOs and authorities came out and said that Israel's obligated under international law to provide vaccines. They didn't specify free or not free. It's an important question. To the Palestinians. And perhaps some evidence of the traction that this argument was getting is that the Palestinian Authority, which originally said they didn't ask for vaccines from Israel, and they don't plan to ask for vaccines from Israel, and that they're fully capable of taking care of their own affairs, began to say two things. A, that they don't want vaccines from Israel, don't plan to take them, and are fully capable of managing their own affairs. And at the same time, to select other audiences saying, the Israelis aren't giving us any vaccines, thus giving further fuel to this argument. There are many matters about Israel's conduct in the West Bank that are subjects, I think, of legitimate debate. One can debate whether Israel is an occupying power in parts of the West Bank. I happen to think it's not, but it's a subject of a legitimate and good faith academic debate. I'm going to show you the legal sources that bear on the question of vaccination. And I think they are so overwhelmingly clear when you actually look at the sources that this is not even a subject of legitimate debate. And I think we need to be very careful. And in general, I think there's a cautionary lesson for any kind of claims about Israel and international law. Don't believe anything until you read it yourself, because many authorities have waved their hands and said, international law says that Israel is obligated. But of course, international law is not some amorphous presence in the sky. It is a series of treaty provisions, and we're going to look at those treaty provisions. Israel's relations with the Palestinian Authority are primarily governed by the Oslo Agreement, which is actually a series of agreements which created the Palestinian Authority and divided authority between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. It is a very long agreement because it deals between the interactions of Israel and the Palestinians in every scope of affairs. Everything from postal matters and archaeology, criminal jurisdiction, and it speaks specifically to the question of public health. I'm going to show you exactly what it says. This is the Oslo Agreement. This Oslo II, as it's known. Oslo in 1993 provides a general framework, and then the Oslo Agreement of 1995, also known as Oslo II, fills in the details for, as you can see, pretty much a huge array of basically every subject that could arise between two governments. I'm sure the UK and the EU will be working on a similarly detailed agreement soon. So Article 17 speaks to health. This is the first place you would look. And what does it say? The powers and responsibilities in the sphere of health in the West Bank and Gaza Strip will be transferred to the Palestinian side. That's it. Israel transferred these powers. So what does that mean? That means that the Palestinian Authority has the power and the responsibility to take care of the public health of the Palestinians within their jurisdiction. I would go further. You see, it says that the powers are transferred to the Palestinian side. That means Israel gives them up. It doesn't mean just that the Palestinians have them. It means that Israel doesn't have them. So it would be actually a violation of the Oslo Agreement for Israel to begin to interfere in the administration of public health for the Palestinian Authority. And of course, public health includes issues of vaccination. This is all within the responsibility of the Palestinian Authority. And I can say that in the now 25-year history of the Oslo Accords, vaccinations happen all the time, and no one has ever suggested that it is Israel's responsibility to provide the Palestinians with any vaccine. Vaccinations are not a new issue. They're not an exotic issue. They're fully addressed in the Oslo Accords. Now, some people say, well, the Oslo Accords were interim agreement. That is to say, they were contemplated to last for only 5 years. That's true, but they continue to apply today because the parties continue to apply them and consider them legally binding. That is to say, when the Palestinians believe Israel has violated provisions of the Oslo Accords, for example, about the transfer of custom revenues, they say you're violating the Oslo Accords. And a few years ago, a Palestinian high court actually ruled that the Oslo Accords are still in effect. This is very common in agreements, either between private parties or countries, if they are for some term, like a 1-year rental, let's say, of an apartment, and then they continue to be applied by the parties after the expiration of the term. That means it is still in effect under its original terms. And to say, as some, so one of the arguments that's implicit in rejecting the application of Article 17 is that the Oslo Accords no longer apply. That would have extraordinary ramifications and means that Israel would have jurisdiction over Area A and B, that there would be no Palestinian Authority, and other things that nobody suggests. So the Oslo Accords clearly make this an open and shut case. Now, some people want to say, well, we don't just want to look at the Oslo Accords. We should also look at the Fourth Geneva Convention. which the Fourth Geneva Convention is a treaty about the conduct of the treatment of civilians in wartime, and also has some provisions about occupation that may last after wartime. Now, I believe the Fourth Geneva Convention is not applicable, and I think the clearest reason is because even under the Geneva Conventions, agreements reached between the parties supersede anything in the Geneva Convention. Oslo would make no sense if it does not update the requirements between obligations between the parties. So where Oslo applies, it is clearly that what applies. Geneva Convention, I would also add, Geneva Convention does not apply because Israel is in fact not occupying for sure area A and B, where the Palestinians maintain full control, run their own government, conduct their own foreign relations, and basically decide the conduct of their own affairs. But let's say you did think that the Geneva Conventions were still relevant. So you would probably start by looking then at the Geneva Conventions, which is not necessarily something that people who have made this argument do. Now, you should see that the title of this treaty, the Geneva Conventions, is not called, the Geneva Convention is called the Protection of Civilians in Time of War. So as you may have noticed, there's no war. There is no state of hostilities between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. So why are we reading the Fourth Geneva Convention? Now, the Fourth Geneva Convention has certain provisions that apply even after a war is concluded if there is an ongoing occupation. And one of the reasons many critics of Israel want to talk about Article 49, which is a provision that they say makes settlements illegal, is because it is one of the provisions that certainly does apply for the duration of an occupation. But let's take a look what it says here. Beginning and end of application. If I was a lawyer, that would be the first thing I would want to look at, because I'm talking about a treaty for the protection of civilians in time of war. There's not obviously a war. So let's see, does this treaty apply? In the case of, so they say it's occupied territory. In the case of the occupied territory, the application of the present convention shall cease 1 year after the close of general military operations. However, certain provisions will continue to apply for the duration of occupation, and Article 56, which is the provision principally governing public health, is not one of them. You see, you have Article 51, 52, 53, not 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, etc. So the public health provisions of the Geneva Conventions, if they ever applied, by the terms of the Geneva Convention itself, have not applied since 1968, which is a very long time, and that's quite clear. This is a well-known provision of the Geneva Convention, and invoking the Geneva Convention without reference to this provision is what I could only call a gross misrepresentation of the relevant law. And that's a very important point. But let's say you think that there is an occupation, which I would argue there isn't, and you think the Geneva Convention does apply, which I would argue it doesn't, and you think that the Geneva Convention applies, but you, for some reason, don't think Article 6 applies. So already that's a completely incoherent position. But let's say you want to ignore Article 6, which says it does not apply quite clearly, and you want to say, but let's apply it, like, even though it says it doesn't apply. I don't know why I would want to do that, but let's say. So then you would look at Article 56, which talks about requirements of public health. And when we talk about the Geneva Conventions, we invariably look at the official International Committee for the Red Cross commentary on the treaty from 1958, which, for better or worse, is seen as quasi-authoritative. And let's take what it looks. It says, there can be no question of making the occupying power alone responsible for the whole burden of organizing hospitals and health services. The task is above all one for the competent services of the occupied country itself. Now, the Geneva Conventions envisions a situation in which there's a war, and in the year after the war, which is the only time that Article 56 actually applies, the public health service is in disarray, there are no hospitals, etc., then an occupied power may have to step in to the extent that there is not an effective functioning public health service. However, in certain cases, if the national authorities are perfectly well capable of looking after the health of the public of the population, there's no role for the occupied power. Indeed, they would just be hampering the work of the organizations responsible. In other words, they shouldn't intervene. They're not supposed to. Now, this is not relevant since 1968 at the most, but we're walking through it just to show how I want to show this argument is wrong on many, many levels and despite many assumptions. Now, let's assume that this is occupied territory, which it's not, that the Geneva Conventions apply, which they don't, and that you can honestly read the Geneva Conventions but skip Article 6 and say that they continue to apply. And you can say, and pretend that the Palestinians don't have a public health service, and so say that Israel is responsible. What's it mean to be responsible? The occupying power will be able to exercise its right of requisition and demand cooperation, not only of the national and local authorities, but of the population in the fight against epidemics. In other words, if we're in this universe where Israel has responsibility, there is nothing in international law that creates a freestanding obligation to provide free vaccines. There is either an obligation to take care of the public health, including vaccination, which comes with it the ability to stand in the shoes of the local authorities and take compulsory public health measures. The right to requisition, what's that mean? Vaccines aren't free. There's absolutely no idea that anyone is entitled to free vaccines, not paid for. The Palestinians are not being discriminated relative to Israelis. They do not pay taxes to Israel, and thus they do not get benefits of non-taxpayers, much like Jordanians don't pay Israeli taxes and do not get Israeli vaccines. If this were to apply, Israel would be allowed to demand payment from the Palestinian authorities at the super premium, roughly $40 a dose, which Israel is paying to get the vaccines on an expedited basis. Would the Palestinians be willing to pay $40 a dose? Almost certainly not. How do we know that? Because nobody but Israel is willing to pay $40 a dose. Not even European countries better positioned to afford it. And there's no suggestion that the Palestinians would be willing to do so. Israel would be able to demand the cooperation of the local population. What does that mean? That means that Israel would be able to enforce quarantine measures, put people into home isolation, enforce mandatory mask mandates, and even require compulsory vaccination of the Palestinian population. Imagine if Israel were to do that, to demand the cooperation of the local people and said, we are hereby providing vaccines to Palestinians and making them get shots. Nobody would say, oh yes, okay, that's wonderful that you do it. They say you're violating human rights. But in the world of the Geneva Conventions, that has not even arguably applied since 1968, that is what would be the case. Nobody thinks that's true. So that just shows you how totally unanchored in any treaty or basis of international law these arguments are. Now, as a matter of fact, the Palestinians are getting vaccines. Where are they getting vaccines from? They're getting them, some of them they're getting from Israel, which just today transferred 5,000 doses to the Palestinians. And they have been negotiating, which is hard to imagine how they could do if they were an occupied power, but they've been negotiating just like every other government in the world negotiates with the manufacturers of vaccines and with the World Health Organization, which has a fund to provide vaccines for lower income countries, and are indeed scheduled to get vaccines. Now they were actually supposed to get vaccines earlier, like in January, but a shipment of Chinese vaccines has been delayed. And in that sense, they find themselves in very good company with Tunisia and very many other countries who have not gotten their vaccines on schedule. Indeed, the Palestinians are expected to receive the vaccination when many, many other countries of comparable GDP in the world will be receiving their vaccines. So there's no thing, they're not getting vaccines. They're getting them exactly when you would expect a country of their economic status to get it. There's an international vaccine fund, which groups the Palestinian Authority with about 93 other lower middle income countries for the distribution of subsidized vaccines. It's up to the Palestinians what vaccines they want. They seem to prefer the Sputnik or Chinese vaccine to the RNA vaccine. That's not something Israel can require for them. Israel can't make them pay a premium. So this argument is based on absolutely nothing. But let's take a look at the features of the argument. It takes a moment of Israeli success, when or perceived success. Israel got good press for its vaccination campaign, and tries to turn it into something evil that Israel is doing. To do that, it rejects the basis of the two-state solution. It rejects the applicability of the Oslo Accords, and rejects actually the language of the Geneva Conventions, while nonetheless invoking them for some kind of authority. And what's the accusation? The accusation is, if true, it would be very horrible, that Israel is depriving Palestinians of some kind of life-saving medicine and contributing to the spread of COVID in the Palestinian territories. Now, this resonates very deeply with classic anti-Semitic tropes of Jews being responsible for the spread of disease. And it's no accident that this accusation has resonated so much, right? Jews are responsible for the spread of disease. Now, what do Israelis take away from this? They say, we signed the Oslo Accords, we created a Palestinian Authority. They're doing something that no occupied people in the world is currently doing. Right? There's no population under occupation that is currently negotiating for and receiving their own vaccine allocations that they will distribute themselves and according to their lights and under their own authority. Palestinians are doing this, and what do we get out of it? It's like none of the benefits of Oslo, with all of the persistence of what I can only call classic anti-Semitic accusations. One can disagree about the wisdom of many aspects of Israeli policy. One can disagree about the status of the West Bank and Gaza, but that nothing in international law requires the free provision of vaccines to the Palestinians, independent of an Israeli takeover of the entire Palestinian public health system, for which nobody advocates, is beyond doubt. So I would say that those who have popularized this idea have greatly discredited themselves. They're not necessarily people who make many only discreditable arguments, but I think we've crossed a line at which this argument needs to not just be rejected, but rather, the real issue is not Israel's failing to meet some kind of international obligation. I would say the real issue here is the rapid and careless spread of legally baseless accusations which resonate with anti-Semitic tropes. And I see we have many chats and Q&As. So
indeed. Well, Eugene, thank you very much for that introduction. Our audience is well practiced and knows the drill, but please continue to put your questions into the Q&A facility. I want to come back to those that are drilling down on the specifics of the legal analysis that you've just presented and start by grouping 3 or 4 questions together that relate to Israel's moral responsibility and ask you, in the context perhaps even this week of Netanyahu recognizing a desire on the part of the Israeli government to provide vaccinations to the Palestinians, in fact following through with that, with 2,000 provided on Monday, a further 5,000 expected in the course of this week, and up to 20,000 anticipated in a couple of weeks. Dealing with the questions that have been coming through, yes, this is all jolly good on the legal side of things, but what is Israel's moral responsibility, and to what extent also do the 4th Geneva Convention provisions pertain to a moral responsibility on Israel?
Okay. So first of all, I want to, it's easy to say, okay, so leave all the legal stuff to one side. But I'm not content to say that. Because when people who gain their credibility by saying we are NGOs who are experts in international humanitarian law. What's the point of legal claims? I want to say why, there's a reason why arguments against Israel are typically phrased in terms of international law. Morality is very debatable, right? Morality is open to a wide number, of interpretations, and very basic questions. When you're driving the trolley down the hill and it's gonna spin out of control, and do you hit the people in front of you, or detour to hit fewer people on the side? Fundamental moral disputes have different perspectives, and we may not agree. The whole point of legal arguments international legal arguments is to say, hey, look, the whole world agrees on these rules, and Israel's breaking them. Right? So the whole world does not agree. As a matter of fact, I would say nobody in the world agrees, because everyone's signed Article 6 of the Geneva Convention, and the Palestinians don't agree because they signed Oslo, and Israel doesn't agree. So I would say that the spreading of, let's say, false legal claims is itself a serious moral issue. And I would first raise the issue of what is the moral responsibility of people who make false legal claims about Israel's responsibility in an area that resonates with blood libels going back to the Middle Ages. I would say that responsibility is a very heavy moral responsibility. I don't think Israel has any. So first, and I'm not an expert on morality, so I didn't get a PhD in morality. I don't know anything more about morality than anyone else. The Palestinians have their own public health service. They want their own public health service. They have different views from Israel on how things should be done. The Palestinian population is generally less vaccine demanding than the Israeli population. That is to say, they have a lower turnout rate, at least based on Jerusalem Palestinians, for vaccinations. So is it moral to make someone pay $40 a dose for something they don't want? I don't know. Is it moral to infantilize a population that has its own government and pretend that government does not exist and does not really meet I would say it's undemocratic. What is Israel, It's funny that the same people who say Israel is committing apartheid, they govern the Palestinians, which is not true at all, and is also anti-Semitic, say Israel should govern the Palestinians with vaccines. So that is to say, part of governing yourself is you have your own government who makes its own deals. Different governments have chosen different COVID strategies in terms of how much they want to pay, when they want to get it, and so forth. Israel has no more moral responsibility for the Palestinians who have their own government than it does for the Jordanians or than the UK has for France. I don't understand what the basis of that moral responsibility would be. There is not a general principle of neighbors have to give each other vaccines. America doesn't give to Mexico, etc. I might even argue that it may be amoral to provide vaccines to the Palestinians, at least early on, in the following sense. These vaccines are vitally crucial to saving lives. In order to save lives, you need to get them in people's arms. In order to get them in people's arms, you need to run a fast and efficient vaccination campaign and be able to also run a PR propaganda campaign to encourage people to take vaccines. Israel can't go on Palestinian TV and propagandize them to take vaccines. They would not take well to that. And nor can Israel run the Palestinian vaccine distribution system. So if Israel has the world's most efficient system for getting as many people vaccinated as fast as possible, it may be amoral to divert those vaccines early on, where they will be to a system where they will be used less and where there will be a higher spillage rate. That means you will get a lower total vaccination rate and people will die. So I don't know much about morality, but dying, choosing a policy that will make more people die could be immoral, not necessarily. So that would be very problematic. Diverting vaccines from people whose tax money paid for it to those who don't could be problematic. So I see certainly no moral, and I even see moral arguments against. Now, all that said, it could be from an epidemiological point of view, it might make sense for Israel to vaccinate or make vaccines available to certain parts of the Palestinian population, those who work in Israel, etc. Israel might think that it's in its own best epidemiological interest, but you don't publish articles in The Guardian or appeal to UK members of parliament to explain to the Israeli Public Health Service what makes sense for their COVID management from a purely epidemiological perspective. You do that to defame Israel and to spread anti-Semitic ideas.
Okay, well, coming back to the law, we've had a question about the Palestinian court case that you referred to regarding the ongoing effect of the Oslo Accords. I've posted what I believe is the correct case into the chat. It's from the 24th of April 2017. Unfortunately, this version is only in Hebrew, but it's AG and others against the Palestinian Authority. So our participants can find it in the chat. We've had a couple of questions relating to the ongoing or potential impact of the Geneva Conventions in parallel with the Oslo Accords. And they're both coming at it from different angles. So I'll put both. The first is if all of the Geneva Convention did apply, and so this is parking the Article 6 argument for a moment, would the Oslo Accords automatically supersede it? And in parallel to that, you may be aware that Andrew Marr very recently interviewed the Israeli health minister on a big morning show in the UK and claimed that UN resolutions or the UN or international law superseded the Oslo Agreement. So this questioner asked, was there any such UN resolution? But what is the impact and interplay of customary international law? And perhaps I could also add into that mix potentially the impact of the additional protocols, if that has any effect on the application of Article 6, if we consider that that's been brought into customary international law.
Israel has not signed the optional protocols, and I don't think it has been brought into customary international law. The United States certainly agrees with that position. The Oslo Accords are completely non-intelligible if they are superseded by the Geneva Convention. That is to say, if they don't apply in cases of conflict with the Geneva Convention, then they just make no sense. What was the point? We remember the Oslo Accords. People thought it had a point. That would mean that Israel does not have to give customs revenues to the Palestinians. It means that there's no Palestinian Authority. Nobody thinks that's the case. The United Nations cites the Oslo Accords very supportively. They see it as a basis of a two-state solution. So nobody thinks the Oslo Accords don't apply. The people who are making this argument want to say the Oslo Accords only apply in those provisions that are prejudicial to Israel, but not where they're helpful to Israel. Now, I don't think this is prejudicial or helpful to Israel either way. It's an authority for the Palestinians. They want to have public health authority. I don't know how you can read the Geneva Conventions and skip Article 6. I just don't understand what that means. Article 6 is a crucial provision. So this part of the Geneva Convention doesn't apply, even if the Geneva Conventions do apply. But if the Geneva Conventions apply, then I think that means that means that all the people who pride themselves for the genesis of Oslo and the peace process were just like out of their minds because they made this long argument and became very famous and won Nobel Prizes for something that doesn't do anything. That doesn't make sense. So it's quite clear that Oslo applies. And I'll tell you, one thing is very clear in international law is the course of dealing between parties can establish obligations, and both parties consistently behave as if Oslo applies and criticize the other side for breaching Oslo, which is the surest sign of its continued applicability between the parties.
And dealing with that framework, a question asks, can Israel block vaccines purchased by the Palestinians to be shipped to Gaza? This questioner asks in order to pressure Hamas. But what is the legal framework behind Israel allowing vaccines and other aid into the Gaza Strip? And how would that apply with regards to the West Bank?
Yeah, that's a good question. As I think you can look up in Article 17. Article 17 presupposes that Israel will cooperate with the transshipment of vaccines, and assuming that they're like normal vaccines and not crazy vaccines, is supposed to cooperate with the Palestinian Authority in doing that. So the problem is, so certainly the Oslo Accords presupposes Israeli cooperation, which doesn't mean a blank check, but cooperation with allowing the entry of vaccines. The problem is Gaza Strip is not controlled by the Palestinian Authority. or it's controlled by a different group that says they're the Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian Authority that the rest of the world calls the Palestinian Authority doesn't recognize them as the Palestinian Authority, namely Hamas. And Hamas is the separate and distinct government. In other words, what happened in Gaza was under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority, and there was, I don't know what you'd call it, a revolution, a coup, but the Palestinian Authority was displaced by force from governing the West Bank, and completely different people came into power. They don't necessarily get their salaries from the Palestinian Authority. They don't get on with the Palestinian Authority. So, whether it needs to be transferred to Hamas, a designated terrorist organization, is a question which Oslo, I think, does not resolve, but certainly does not require. And maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's a bad idea. But in general, transferring things to terrorist organizations is not a good idea. Not because we want to put pressure on them, but because I doubt that Hamas is going to distribute this vaccine in any kind of equitable manner. I would assume that they would give it to Hamas members first, and so forth. But nonetheless, I expect when the vaccines come and when the Palestinian Authority does take delivery of them, I do expect Israel will allow this shipment, and Israel has currently not blocked any shipments of vaccines to Gaza or anywhere else.
Now, some of the commentators in this debate, and in fact some academics, have advanced Israeli Supreme Court jurisprudence to justify their arguments for an Israeli legal obligation to provide vaccinations. And in particular, I think the 1991 case of Marcus and Minister of Defense, and this case was in the context of the fear of chemical attack by Iraq in the First Gulf War. It related to the distribution of gas masks. Now, accepting that this is, of course, pre-Oslo, what is your reading of that case and in fact subsequent Israeli Supreme Court case law post-Oslo that talks about the responsibilities of the State of Israel to Palestinians living under the authority of the Palestinian autonomy?
First of all, I love this idea of citing Israeli Supreme Court cases. We need to take it much further. There's a very strange approach, which I'm not fully comprehending, of people citing as decisive authority on matters of international law Israeli Supreme Court cases when they can be used to argue against Israel. You say, even the Israeli Supreme Court case. So either we care what the Israeli Supreme Court says, or it does, or we don't. I'll take, if it's the case that the Israeli Supreme Court is an authoritative decider of Israel's obligations in the territory, then we'd be living in a very different universe, because of course the Israeli Supreme Court does not consider Jewish communities or settlements in Judea and Samaria to be illegal. In fact, it considers them legal and rules about their legality and where they can build and where they can't build all the time. So, but if we're living in a world where the Israeli Supreme Court is the authoritative interpreter, it will be a very different world. So I want to point out that this is an opportunistic cherry picking of Israeli Supreme Court precedent. But again, a 1991 case about gas masks before Oslo, when there was no Palestinian Authority, has absolutely no bearing now, because again, Article 17 transfers this responsibility. So whatever responsibility Israel had, Israel has given to the Palestinian Authority, and it can't claw it back. So I think that's a very important point.
Yesterday, we had an organisation in the UK, Medical Aid for Palestinians, publish their analysis of these legal issues. And I have to say that you have pretty comprehensively dealt with the arguments that they advance with respect to the Geneva Conventions and the disapplication of Oslo. That's one of the strands of their argument. It appears to me that there is a second strand to their argument that relies on a premise that the Palestinians are unable to provide vaccinations for their own population as a result of what it describes as the stranglehold of occupation. So I appreciate that this is used to buttress the argument that they seek to ground in the legal analysis. But it's, I think,
say it again.
Yes,
I
of
missed
course.
a sentence. Can you?
So the way that they've framed what strikes me as a second leg to attempting to ground Israeli responsibility for vaccinating Palestinians under the Palestinian Authority and the Gaza Strip is by citing Israel's blockade on Gaza and what it calls Israel's occupation of the West Bank, suggesting that because of that situation, the Palestinians don't have the finances to supply vaccinations to their own population, and therefore Israel has a legal obligation to provide them. Almost Israel broke it, so it has to fix it. Analysis, perhaps. What do you make of that aspect of this report's reasoning?
The Palestinian Authority is far from the poorest government in the world. It's not in the bottom third. I don't even know if it's in the bottom half. So the GDP of the Palestinian Authority is easily comparable to many other countries that are getting vaccines, and there's various programs for countries to get subsidized vaccines. There's nothing about the Palestinian Authority that bespeaks any incompetence of getting the vaccines. And in fact, they're getting them. They're under contract to get them. The delivery was late through no fault of Israel or the Palestinians, but many countries are getting the deliveries late. But again, I think what we see here is a position looking for some kind of argument. That is to say, Article 17 of the Oslo presupposes the current situation. Right? They're saying there's an occupation, okay? But this is Oslo. So they're saying Oslo, they want to cancel Oslo in order to indict Israel. And it can't cancel Oslo. But in any case, there is no actual obstacle to the Palestinians getting the vaccines. There has not been one any, and I don't think there will be one. I don't expect they're going to have a very high uptake, at least at first, of the vaccine, judging by other Arab governments. But nonetheless, I think it's going to be available. So there's no evidence of brokenness, right? It's just an assertion.
So a couple of questions touching on the practicality.
Let me make another point like this. Nobody says that the UK or the US is responsible for vaccinating Libya. Who's responsible for vaccinating Libya? I don't know, but a bunch of countries broke Libya in 2011 in a very explicit aerial campaign authorized by the UN Security Council. So no one has said those countries broke Libya. Now they're responsible for vaccinating. That's not an argument that's made. Now, making an argument about Israel that you don't make about any other country, well, that's problematic in obvious ways. And I bet vaccination rates in Libya are going to be a lot lower than in the Palestinian Authority.
Well, while we're dealing with vaccination in the region, certainly it's been reported in an Arabic language newspaper that in Lebanon there have been calls not to vaccinate the Palestinian population living within the country. It's been unclear so far as to what's going to become of the Palestinian population in Jordan. But certainly those issues haven't garnered nearly the sort of press attention that has been focused on this issue with respect to Israel. What do you see? And of course, we're talking about a very different situation with the Palestinians living in Jordan and Lebanon, respectively, because they are not self-governing as those in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are. But what do you see as the legal responsibilities of the Jordanian and Lebanese government with respect to Palestinians within their jurisdiction?
I don't think it's going to be governed by international law. I don't think international law says anything about a country's obligation to vaccinate its own population. I don't think these people fall under international law because they are not refugees. I think it would be considered scandalous that many countries continue to deny citizenship to Palestinians living for multiple generations within their borders and have them as permanent second-class citizens. But I think the people who like to talk about Palestinians being second-class citizens are not actually interested in whether Palestinians are second-class citizens, as they are in, for example, Lebanon, or whether they're not, as they're not in the West Bank, but rather are interested in arguments to defame Israel. So I don't know that there's an international law obligation, but certainly it's a very problematic situation there.
Well, one of the arguments that I've seen advanced in parallel to those on the basis of the Geneva Conventions is an argument grounded in international human rights law, and in particular, principles against discrimination. Does that, to your mind, apply particularly in the context of, I suppose we're dealing with customary principles here as opposed to convention, but with respect to the situation in Jordan and Lebanon, but also as a supplementary question to that, how does international human rights law potentially, arguably apply to the situation in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip?
I think it certainly does not override the Oslo Accords, and I think it's very hard to point to a generalizable anti-discrimination principle in international human rights law that can be applied on such a detail. As a matter of fact, every country is discriminating to some extent in its vaccine rollout. Its vaccine rollout, by definition, involves discrimination, prioritization, and so forth. But Israel, but certainly there's no notion, whereas I'm more interested in the question of Israel, in this case, in Lebanon, that a country needs to vaccinate people under the governance and jurisdiction of another government. Right? There's like various ideas on blogs criticizing vaccine nationalism, the idea that you vaccinate your own citizens first. But in fact, there is no country that is not pursuing a policy of vaccine nationalism. Certainly nothing international law prohibits it.
A couple of questions focusing on the practicality. So if Israel was minded to roll out the vaccination in a significant way within
Palestinian territories.
Well, these are the questions. How might Israel, hope to get Palestinian people's cooperation in instituting, maintaining, and enforcing such measures to prevent the transmission of the virus, as well as to vaccinate the population?
I think the transmission of COVID would be the least of the problems that would arise if Israeli government pulls into Jenin and says, we got shots for everyone, come get your shots. I think this would be met with extraordinary popular unrest, and would be also seen by would be immediately denounced by the Palestinian Authority as an invasion of their governmental powers. The transmission of, there wouldn't be a transmission of COVID problem, there would be like a riot. And also international condemnation of Israel for intruding into the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority. The people who are arguing for Israel providing the vaccines is not arguing that Israel should actually ensure that the Palestinians get vaccinated. They're saying that Israel should turn over parts of the vaccines that they have purchased at great cost and are implementing in their highly effective strategy, and give them to the Palestinian Authority. Now, what the Palestinian Authority does with them, I don't know, is not, I think, part of this criticism. I expect if the Palestinian Authority were to misuse them, as is not unlikely, Israel would be criticized for that also. But the delivery mechanism is not really a part of this discussion, though it should be. That is to say, you can't just, you don't just rain vaccines down on a population without taking measures to make sure that they get them. I think it is very likely that any pro-vaccination measure coming from Israel would be greatly resented by the Palestinian population.
Now, a key question, which we should have dealt with earlier, but it's only just been asked now. We've focused on areas outside of formal Israeli jurisdiction. Has Israel vaccinated Palestinians living in Israel? Is the question that's...
that is to say, yeah. So the way vaccinations work in Israel is they're done through primarily through the Kupot, the medical HMOs. And whoever if you mean, so East Jerusalem Palestinians who need not live in East Jerusalem, or residents of Israel can live anywhere, and Israeli Arabs get the vaccination, or eligible for vaccination, just like any other Israeli.
And that applies.
Yes, that applies.
That applies to residents as opposed to just citizens. So it's on the basis of the registration with the local health authorities. Interestingly enough, last summer,
just like any other permanent resident. So permanent resident, tourists not eligible, any permanent residents are eligible.
And the arguments that we've been hearing being advanced now, some of them have even characterized the West Bank as being under Israeli jurisdiction, but I think that you've dealt pretty succinctly with that in your opening. A lot of the arguments that have been advanced on that basis, though, tend to operate in exactly the opposite direction of the sort of debate that existed over the course of last summer, with respect to Israel's proposals to extend its jurisdiction, or perhaps better expressed as applying its civilian law in parts of Area C. And we've had a question here that pertains specifically to the obligation to vaccinate Palestinians living in Area C. Could you deal with that potentially in two parts? Firstly, the way that this question has been framed, I'll just read it out. Article 6A2 of the Proclamation 7 by the military commander regarding the implementation of the interim agreement states that the civil administration will keep its powers and responsibilities regarding Area C. Since the proclamation is local law and it overrides the interim agreement, do you see this as a basis for an obligation at least to vaccinate Palestinians in Area C? If I can put that as part one of the question, and part two be, what would the difference be if Israel had carried out its proposals that were being debated last summer?
Okay, so first of all, I want to make a point that nobody is suggesting, of the people criticizing Israel for not vaccinating, nobody is criticizing Israel for not vaccinating the Israeli Palestinians in Area C. That is not an argument that anyone has made. They're saying Israel has a general, across the board obligation to vaccinate presumably every Palestinian from Nablus to Hebron. So if you think there's a more reasonable version, I want to point out nobody's making a reason, that version. They're making an argument, and I want to focus going forward. What's much more important, is the notion that arguments like this, accusing Israel of allowing disease to spread in a population, that are contrary to all written treaties. The fact that arguments like that can be made in polite society is shockingly, shockingly disturbing, and I would say conflicts with the internationally accepted International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism. I think that's an extremely serious issue. Okay, so Palestinians in Area C are interesting because it's an interesting issue because so the commander's declaration is consistent with Oslo. It doesn't need to override it. Oslo gives Israel civil jurisdiction territorially over Area C, but in matters dealing with persons, jurisdiction is personal. That is to say, the Palestinian Authority retains basically various jurisdictional powers over Palestinians in Area C. So, for example, it is not the case that in Area C is, the Ministry of Education of Israel provides the the textbooks for the Palestinian schools. The Palestinian schools in Area C are run by the Palestinian Authority, and public health is also made available through the Palestinian Authority. So their public health needs are generally addressed through the Palestinian Authority, and nothing has changed. Right, the fact that Israel is doing well at COVID vaccination does not change the does not change anything about the distribution of power between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, in which Palestinians are, even in Area C, are considered subject to the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority. I don't see the point of discussing what would happen if something that didn't happen had happened. I think that's a strange kind of discussion. I will tell you what would have happened is if Israel had applied its law to parts of Area C, as had been discussed, Israel would almost certainly have given an option for citizenship to the Palestinians in that territory, based on the precedent of Jerusalem. So, so the international community would say, yes, you've given the Palestinians citizenship, and now they'll get vaccines and pay Israeli taxes and other things they probably don't want to do. Yay. No, of course, the international community would say, you've given an option for full citizenship to the Palestinians. We're going to pass a UN Security Council resolution condemning it. And how do I know that that's what's going to happen? Because that's what happened when Israel did it with Jerusalem. So the argument about applying Israeli law is a heads I win, tails you lose. You're not applying Israeli law. Look, Palestinians have this different status. You apply Israeli law and give everyone an option for citizenship, as happened in Jerusalem. You're cementing the occupation. That's not okay either. So I think the status of the Palestinians is a complete red herring, because those who most like to harp on it are those who would protest the loudest if if Palestinians living in Area C, for example, were given Israeli citizenship.
So a pertinent point that's been raised with respect to the argument that we were discussing, can the Palestinians afford a vaccine? I mean, apart from the fact that they've also enrolled now in COVAX after exploring the Russian vaccination, the point well made with respect to the Palestinian Authority pay for slay policy and the sorts of funds that are being spent on encouraging terrorism. Paying terror salaries based on how successful people have been in terrorists have been in achieving their aim of the number of Israeli civilian casualties that they're able to extract. So a point well made, and one additional one coming from the audience, which is perhaps more practical, but can Israel demand that Palestinian day workers be vaccinated at the border so that they do not spread disease in Israel proper? Now, of course, there are thousands of Palestinians coming over across the board through checkpoints with permits in order to work in various parts of Israel, come over for the day and they go back. That transfer of people will have been.
It's a general question that many countries are going to have to wrestle with. Can you demand vaccination as a condition of employment in general? And there's no answers to that anyway yet. That's one of the open questions about vaccination. For example, will what about Israeli? Can an Israeli employer demand that workers be vaccinated as a condition of coming to employment? I think it's unclear.
And then the final question to end on: is there any comparing or contrasting going on with regard to the legal obligations and carrying out vaccination campaigns in places like Cyprus, Crimea, Kashmir, or has that been left out of the conversation entirely?
I've not heard anything about anyone's obligation to vaccinate anywhere outside of their territory that they govern. Previously, I think Libya is an interesting example on the you broke it, you're responsible model. Again, this argument, so the idea of COVID vaccinations has been around for a long time, right? As soon as COVID started, literally weeks before it even hit the press, Pfizer and Moderna were already working on their vaccines, and they were working, and they did stage 1 trials, and they did stage 2 trials, and they did stage 3 trials. And all that time, nobody said that Israel has to vaccinate the Palestinians. And then Israel got the vaccines, and no one was saying Israel has to. And then it turns out Israel did this great thing that made it look really good. Now Israel has to vaccinate the Palestinians. So I think the argument is obviously entirely contingent on
that. Indeed. We have, throughout this process, of course, focused on the arguments that have been made to underpin the sorts of stories that were covered in the likes of The Guardian. I think that the choice title in the Morning Star was Israel's Vaccine War. With respect to The Guardian, we had Palestinians excluded from Israel COVID vaccine rollout as jabs go to settlers. And obviously a number of campaigns waged by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, perhaps the usual suspects on this. And therefore your analysis has focused on their application of Geneva 4 and the impact of the Oslo Accords. Just going, and this is the sort of the final closing remarks, onto the starting point or the bottom line in terms of the status of the territory. It strikes me that, and you've covered this in previous talks, there are clearly real problems with the application of the occupation framework under international law. But even if we look past the status of the territory and how and in what legal framework Israel came into possession of it in 1967, and we look past the peace treaty with Jordan in 1994, which would end any status of Indeed, or even past, if the argument were that Israel, in fact, rather than fighting the Jordanians in 1967, had in fact, by some sort of proxy, been fighting a Palestinian entity, then the Oslo Accords would be that peace accord that would bring any pre-existing occupation to an end also. So in that context, could I just ask you to close perhaps with the briefest of analyses on what the situation, putting aside the arguments that have been made on the basis of occupation, really comes down to, if we take that out of the equation?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So the starting point on the status of the territory.
You can only occupy territory. Let me put it this way. There's a debate, which is, I think, a legitimate debate, on whether you can occupy territory that is not under the sovereignty of another country. I think that's an honest debate. What's quite clear is that you cannot occupy territory to which one has that is friendly territory. You cannot occupy your own territory, cannot occupy territory of a co-belligerent. And it's important to understand that the territory, the so-called West Bank, was simply the area of mandatory Palestine that was occupied by Jordan in 1948. We surely do not believe that the use of force can change pre-existing borders. And the pre-existing border was the borders of the League of Nations mandate, which would become the borders of the new country. That means those borders could not have been changed by Jordan in 1948. And thus, when Israel took this territory in 1967, it was in the exact same position as Azerbaijan, which recently retook parts of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is an area populated entirely by Armenians, which has never been under the control of the Azerbaijani government previously, but which was, when it was put under Armenian control, had previously been within the borders of the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic, Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic, and thus are considered under international law within the territory of its successor state, Azerbaijan. The cases are extraordinarily close. No one is actually, it's not even a question whether Azerbaijan is occupying Nagorno-Karabakh when it has retaken it after some 20 years after independence, more than 20 years after independence, and without having any Azerbaijanis there. But even if there was an occupation that started in 1967, you don't have to take it from me, take it from the United States State Department legal advisor in the Carter administration, who wrote a memo that was the basis of early arguments that Israel is an occupying power, and said that, and he said in 1978, of course, if Israel were to make peace with Jordan, there would be no more occupation because there's no such thing as occupation in a situation of peace. Now, of course, when he wrote that in 1978, maybe he didn't expect that Israel would indeed make peace with Jordan. So that argument has been completely buried and forgotten. When it turns out that Israel did make peace with Jordan, now one needs more new arguments. So I think the occupation framework is not the right one. But even if it were the right one, the Geneva Convention, by its own terms, does not apply past 68. And even if it did apply past 68, it does not require Israel to provide vaccinations, given that the Palestinians have their own functioning health service, which is negotiating for them, which makes you wonder why so many people are so eager to make with such intensity a legal argument that is so, I think, frivolous.
Well, Professor Eugene Kontorovich, thank you very much for tying all of that together. I can see from the chat, which has been exploding, that it's prompted the most incredible debate with all of our participants. I anticipate that that will continue over the weeks and months, but you have given us a wonderful insight to the legal framework and the legal underpinnings, which have been not only overlooked, but crucially misrepresented by so many of the reports on this subject. So thank you very much for taking the time, and thank you to our audience for joining us. See you next time.
Take care. Thank you all.